The chart control can give insight into your business's metrics by presenting a dynamic, graphical view of your data that changes as your database grows. Unlike exporting data to Excel and graphing there, creating your graphs directly within Access maintains the live, always updated link to your data tables and queries. Further, pairing a chart with a query gives you all the flexibility of adding query criteria to instantly refine the chart's data set. In this movie, we're going to create a chart object. And in the next movie, we're going to bring this chapter full circle and incorporate some other form controls that will take user input to alter the chart's parameters. Now, I'd like to mention up front that the chart object uses a rather old interface called Microsoft Graph, and it hasn't been updated in quite a few versions. They can be a little wonky to use, and it might take a few tries to get something usable. So with that caveat out of the way, let's get started. First, I want to create a query that'll gather the data that we want to graph. I'll go up to the Create tab, and we'll start a new query in Design View. For this chart, I want to count up the number of orders that were placed over time. So I'm going to go over here to the Orders table and add that to my query design. I'll go ahead and close the Show Table window here, and I'm going to add in the order date and the order ID fields by double-clicking on them to add them into the query. We can go ahead and run the query here by using this button up here. If I look on the bottom, I can see that we have 2,200 records that represent all of the orders that were placed. Let's go ahead and save this query. I'll press Ctrl S on the keyboard, and I'll call this Order Dates. That adds it over here to my navigation pane. Let's go ahead and close out this query. Now we're ready to start on a new form. I'll go to the Create tab and Form Design. The chart object is this item here in the Controls group. It has the colored bars. Let's go ahead and select it, and I'll come down here into my form, and I'll drag out a big rectangle. When I do that, the chart wizard starts, and it asks me which table or query I want to use as a data source for the chart. Right now I'm just seeing the tables here. I can change this radio button over here to Queries to see the query we just built. I'll go ahead and select this Order Dates query and press Next. Now it asks me which fields contain the data we want for the chart. We've got the available fields here and the fields for the chart over here. Let's go ahead and add them both. I'll press this button right here to move them over. Let's go ahead and say Next. Now we get to choose which type of chart we want. We have some various bar and column charts, including 3D options over here. I'm just going to stick with the basic line chart, which is this one down here. Let's go ahead and select it and press Next. Now we get to define which data is going to appear on what area of the chart. Now we have these three drop zones, this data section up here, this one here that says Order ID, and this one over here that says Order Date by Month. Access tries to help us out by filling in these values, but usually it gets it wrong. So I'm actually going to delete all of these that are already pre-populated. Let's go ahead and take this one, this Order Date by Month, and I'll click and I'll drag it over here to remove it from that section. We'll do the same thing with this Order ID here. We'll click and drag it over here. That'll clear up my three drop zones. So now I have a data zone, a series zone, and an access zone. Now what I want to do is count up the number of orders over time. So my order ID is actually going to get dragged and dropped into this data section over here. My order date is going to get dragged and dropped onto the x-axis down here. It automatically defaults to order date by month. If I wanted to change the time scale, I can just double click on it to bring up this window to define the grouping by level. You can see I can choose from year, quarter, month, week, day, hour, and so on. I'm just going to leave it on month and go ahead and say OK. That'll take all of my dates and group them together in the same month so I can get a total quantity for the month of May, for example, or the month of June. Let's go ahead and accept this and press Next. Now we get to give our chart a title. I'm going to call it Number of Orders per Month. And we'll go ahead and press the Finish button. Now that'll add in a chart placeholder object into our form. Now don't be confused about this east and west and north and these first and second quarters over here. This is just a placeholder image. When we go over to view our form here, we'll see the actual data get populated. Okay, so here's our chart. Now it's a little bit wonky. It's hard to read with all the data populated on top of each other. So we need to go through and clean this up a little bit. Switch our view back into Design View. Now in order to make this a little bit wider, what we can do is move this over here, and I'm going to drag this over to make it a little bit wider. When I do that, the chart resizes, so it makes it a little bit more legible. I can continue to resize this out so it makes it a little bit more spaced out. Maybe I can give myself some more room. The charts tend to work better when they're narrower, I found, so if you make it shorter, sometimes that's easier to read. I can also get rid of this legend over here. I'll double click on it to enter in the chart editing view. I'll go ahead and close out this data sheet, and then I'll select this legend item over here and press Delete. That gives me even more room for my chart object. Now you might need to fiddle around with this a little bit. You might need to drag it open a little bit and then close it down a little bit. Sometimes it resizes dramatically when you do that. If you want to change any of these properties here, we can simply double click on things. For instance, these black bars in the background, I can double click on those to change their properties. Maybe I want to change them from black to a gray color. I'll go ahead and say OK, and that'll fill them in gray instead of dark black. While we're editing our chart, we're inside of this Microsoft Graph editing environment. So you see we have these different menus across the top over here. We can go through some of these menus to find things we might like to add to our chart. For instance, if I go over here to this chart window here, I can add a trend line. It's going to ask me which type of regression I would like. I can either choose a linear regression or a logarithmic regression. I'm going to go ahead and leave it on linear. Go ahead and say OK, and it adds a trend line here. Now let's go ahead and click off of this graph to return back into my Access database. I can go ahead and save this form here, and I'm going to go ahead and save this as orders by month. One more time, we'll return into Form View to see the results. Now, because this graph is built off of this underlying query, this order dates query that we created earlier, we can actually go into the query and modify the parameters. Right now, the graph is showing me data all the way from December 08 through April 2014. I can limit this timescale by editing the query. I'll right-click on the query and go into Design View. Down here underneath the order date, I'm going to click in this criteria row here, and I'm going to type in a different date range. Actually, let me right-click on it and say Zoom so I can get a bigger window to type in. Let's take a look at data from all of 2013. I'll type in between 1/1/2013 and 12/31/2013. We'll go ahead and say OK, and it'll save that criteria down there. Let's go ahead and save the query, and we'll return over here to our graph. I'll go up here and press Refresh All, and it'll refresh the data to represent the new year that we were just looking at, all the way from January 2013 through the end of December 2013. So the chart object allows us to better visualize patterns that might be hidden in our data, and adding in a trend analysis and forecasting abilities can help you see the bigger picture of where you've been and where you're going. Now in the next movie, we're going to take this chart one step further and incorporate some of the other controls to help us make this chart a little bit more flexible.